Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, today I'm really excited to be speaking with Doug Lemov. Doug, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show.
Thanks, Dan. It's great to be back.
Yeah, well, you came on right at the beginning of the Sports Psych Show when we first started out a couple of years ago. So it's super cool to have you back on. What we'll do is most people out there will know who you are, know about your work, but why don't you reintroduce yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Okay, great. I'm an author. I write books about teaching mostly, and being involved in the world of sport has been a little bit of a journey for me. My primary work is studying teachers, particularly high-performing teachers, often through game film and trying to understand what they do that makes them so effective in the classroom. And over time, I started to get requests from people in the sports sector to help them think about coaching, a form of teaching, and what moves that I'd studied from teachers in the classroom were applicable to coaches. And so that was fascinating and fun. And then over time, there are just a bunch of different questions that came up in working with coaches and thinking about teaching that I love sport and I've played it all my life and set out to try and answer. I was often struck by that I knew there was science to answer some of the questions out there. And so I kind of went on this journey of deep study of teaching in the sports sector, combined with reading cognitive psychology and other forms of science to be able to make sure that there's some justification for the answers that I was giving people. And ultimately that turned into this book that I've written called The Coach's Guide to Teaching, which is now out, and I offer with equal degrees of excitement and trepidation, possibly terror.
No terror needed. I mean, I've spent the week running through the chapters, going back and forward, and I've loved every second of reading it, Doug. I think it's an essential text and will continue to be an essential text for coaches. And it's interesting, you spoke about entering the sports industry, sports coaching industry, with a bit of trepidation. You actually start the book. So we're going to talk about the book today and the Coach's Guide to Teaching, and we're going to go through each chapter. But actually, I found it really interesting in your introduction. You kind of almost illustrated that trepidation. I think it was probably in the early stages of your venture into sports and sports coaching, and you relay a story how you stood in front of an audience of quite high-profile coaches, I think it was, and you suffered what seemed to be a little bit of anxiety. You thought, the stuff I've got here, they're just not going to be interested at all. This information, this is way below them. It's just not going to be good enough. And I mean, imposter syndrome is probably the term I was looking for here. But actually, what you found was they really resonated with the material.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was. It's interesting that you made that connection. I started the introduction to the book with this story of I was so excited and honored to get invited to present to this sort of professional license course for the U.S. Soccer Federation. So this is coaches from our top domestic league. I'm in a room with guys whose work I followed. I watched them as players. I watched them as coaches. And right before they introduced me, I'm just like flipping through my slides, and I'm like, what was I thinking about the presentation that I'm about to give? Like my plan was, I'm going to show these guys classroom first videos of a math teacher at a high school in Brooklyn, and we're going to study what classroom teachers do, and they're going to then apply it to what they do in coaching professional athletes. And 30 seconds before they introduced me, I just had this crisis of conscience where I thought, how could I have possibly thought that would go well? But it was too late to change it. So I walked to the front of the room. I started showing this video. It's of a math teacher. He's walking, or he gives the kids an assignment to do. He's walking around the classroom, observing their work and giving them feedback on their work. And I showed about a minute and a half of it, and I stopped the video. And I just asked the coaches what they observed about what the teacher was doing that they thought might be relevant to their endeavor. And I was expecting crickets, which is teacher talk for nobody answers, and there's an awkward silence. And one coach said he's teaching everybody. And I honestly, in this moment, I thought he's really just being nice, and he knows that here's this helpless guy at the front of the room. He's trying to bail me out by saying something. And so I said, well, say more about that. And he said, well, I just noticed that as he works around the classroom, he gives feedback to every student, and that lets every student feel like they're important and they're a critical part of this endeavor. And when I think about our training sessions, there are lots of guys who don't get feedback from us in a given day, or who don't get feedback from us, for days at a time. And suddenly I'm sitting here thinking, how does that look from their perspective? How do they feel about their relationship to the team if we aren't constantly reinforcing, it's really, really important to me to get you better. I want to help you improve. And then another coach weighed in with this really profound observation. He said, guys at this level, they want two things. They want to get better and they want to play. And so relationships are critically important to our work. It's a relational work, but you can't just walk around backslapping guys and high-fiving guys and hoping that you'll build great relationships with them. You have to prove that you can make them better and that you're vested in making them better, or, all that stuff kind of rings hollow. And it was a really profound moment for me because I thought those were really insightful, and not just insightful for coaches. I think they're insightful for teachers. There are a lot of teachers in classrooms who want to build culture by, high-fiving kids and asking them about what they did over the weekend. And I'm when I write my next teaching book, I'm going to quote that coach. Like, it's, the relationship starts with your capacity to invest in somebody and show them that you want to make them better and that you have the ability to make them better. That's one of the ways that you engender trust in people.
Well, you said there one of the coaches said that the players at this level are passionate about getting better. They want you to have information and advice for them to be able to improve. And I think coaches at that level, and I think the vast majority of coaches want to get better. So I do think they make the connection, Doug. And in terms of making the connection, and just again, before we get on to chapter 1, I loved your little bit of honesty at the beginning. You talked about, this is your main sport historically has been soccer. And so in many respects, it's delivered with soccer examples. But other coaches will get it. Basketball coaches, predominantly coaches from team invasion sports, will be able to utilize the ideas in this book. But what I would want to say to you, mate, is that having been a golf coach, I wish I had this book back when I was coaching, because some of the principles, some of the neurological elements that you speak about are vital for golf coaches, for tennis coaches. I will obviously work as a sports psychologist across sports now. I think coaches make the connections, and this is going to be a really, really important read for coaches across all sports. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Thank you for that. I that was a real struggle for me in writing the book, because I feel like coaching is a teaching endeavor, and I wanted to both be humble. I think there's nothing worse than trying to pretend like you know more than you do, and using examples from all sports. And I don't really speak other sports. And I think one of the things I love about coaches is how passionate they are about domain knowledge. And, I one time at a workshop showed a video to a group of soccer football coaches, of a coach giving what I thought was brilliant feedback to a group of players. And he just had this beautiful, clear delivery about what he wanted, and he dropped his voice to in just the right way to connect with the athletes he was talking to. And I stopped the video, and there's practically a riot in the room, because he was teaching the drill in which he was giving this feedback was a drill in overlapping outside backs, and he was doing it in the back half of the field, they said, and that should be done in the front half of the field. And I said, great, good point. When you run this drill, run it in the front half of the field. What did you think about his feedback? And literally no one could talk about the feedback. They were so distracted by the fact that they objected to to his tactical decision. And I was just, I was struck. I think it's important to respect how much knowledge there is in the field. And so I didn't want to try and pretend that I knew sports that I didn't. But I do think that the lessons are applicable across a broad range of sports. I tried to ask a group of coaches that I love from different sports to just sort of start the conversation by adding these sidebars where they talk about, well, here's how I'd apply this in rugby or basketball or baseball. Because that's what I hope that people will do. People tell me all the time about the book, The Inner Book of Tennis, which they say is great. And it's not tennis coaches who are telling me about that book, right? Right. So I hope that people will be able to find things of value no matter what sport they coach.
No, but I resonate with everything you're saying, because it's something I've been challenged by. I mean, of my 4 books, 3 of them are soccer books, and one of them's a golf book. And I've always been very, very conscious of domain, as you say, domain specific knowledge, language, the language of a sport. And I've always been really delighted when a basketball coach has got in contact and said, "Oh, I really liked your book, say Soccer Tough," and I was able to use the principles. But I do think whether it's coaching, sports psychology, I completely agree with you. I think we have to be humble in our writing, and understand and respect that each sport has a language and domain knowledge. And I think we need less or fewer generic books and more specific, sports specific books, and trust that other coaches will pick
Yeah.
them up, if that makes sense.
I think it makes perfect sense. I think that's, I think if I tried to talk about basketball, though I'm sure there are analogies in basketball, I would lose credibility instantly. And I do think, I love the way you phrase it. I trust people to be able to take the ideas and adapt them and apply them, and they'll do smarter things. That's one of the main lessons of my books on teaching, which is you give a teacher a good idea and they do 3 things with it that you never thought of. And you're like, how could I have not seen that? That's so brilliant. And so, I keep rewriting my sort of core teaching book, which is called Teach Like a Champion, based on the fact that every time you give a humble, reflective, smart practitioner a tool, they do brilliant things with it that you never anticipated. And then it becomes this kind of virtuous cycle. So I hope that will happen here, which is coaches in other sports will take ideas and they'll apply them in settings that I hadn't anticipated. And I'll think, wow, how could I not have thought of that? It's so brilliant.
Well, let's get cracking on breaking down this book.
Yeah.
So 6 chapters, the ability to decide, planning and design, giving feedback, checking for understanding, building culture, issues in growth and development. And an overarching comment I'm going to make before we get started is that I just love the granular approach to the writing in this book and the specific examples. I just think they're just really important for coaches. It gives them a real understanding of what great teaching can look like within their coaching process and practice. Let's start with chapter 1, the ability to decide. It felt like here, Doug, that you're challenging us as coaches to take decision making seriously.
Mm. Yeah, and it's interesting because I think one of the reasons why I started with this chapter is because coaches tell me so often it's so important to them, and how profound they think decision making is and how much they struggle with it. And if I can maybe be honest, how often when coaches would tell me about decision making, I'd say there were sort of two categories of conversations. One where I was just struck by how incredibly well informed and how they'd read the research. And I talk a lot about Daniel Kahneman and his book Thinking Fast and Slow. And I remember being at meeting with coaches at a minor league baseball franchise in a tiny Rust Belt city in some corner of the U.S. that most people would struggle to find on a map. And I was struggling to find a phrase from Kahneman's book, and one of the coaches pulls his book out of his backpack and says, "I think the phrase you mean is this." He flips open his dog-eared copy of this, relatively not obscure because Kahneman's work is won the Nobel Prize, but had read the science. But at the same time, I would have conversations with people that were not informed by science, where they would often believe things that I actually have been, because I've been reading the cognitive science for teachers. They believe the things that teachers believe, but they're false. And I think one of the most important ones is people want to believe, because it's a beautiful dream, that higher order thinking, decision making, is a transferable skill, which is that you can teach it. You can teach something called decision making, and that if you do it, you can then apply it to almost any setting. And that, you see this in the classroom all the time, and people say, "Why would I teach facts and knowledge when people can Google anything, any piece of knowledge and facts?" And so what I should teach is problem solving skills and decision making skills. And the answer to that, I think a cognitive scientist would give you, is because problem solving is domain specific. And you can't have insights about something you don't know about. And if you want to think deeply about something, you have to invest in background knowledge. And I think that is true of sport as well. That if you want players to make really strong decisions, they have to understand. First of all, you have to have a vocabulary for them to talk about it. And if you want players to get in between the lines and break lines, kids will nod, or players, not just kids, honestly, players will nod when you use those phrases, but it doesn't mean that they understand them. And it doesn't mean that they can see in their minds what you're talking about. when you're talking about it. And so investing in like, here's what we mean by playing in between the lines, and here are 3 videos to show you what it looks like, and here's a definition of that term, and throughout our club we're going to define that term the same way. um, or even I think about my daughter plays in a really great club, and one of the things I stress is receiving the ball side on, which is also sometimes referred to as receiving the ball in the half turn.
Mm.
And so in her life, half of her coaches have told her
Mm.
to receive the ball in a half turn, and half of them have told her to receive the ball side on. And I don't think she ever connected those two things and realized that they were the same thing. And so half of her knowledge about that conceptual idea never connected with the other half, purely because of vocabulary. And so, which I think is maybe the most fundamental form of background knowledge. So I think one thing that I was trying to stress here was, I realized that there was maybe a lack of valuation on background knowledge in the sports sector, and that was one of the things I was hoping that people get out of the chapter. And I think the other thing was just understanding the importance of the role of perception, and that so often, you can't make the right decision unless you're looking at the right things as an athlete and know what you're looking for. Um, and so much of our looking behavior is unconscious. 10 million of the 11 million sensory receptors in your brain are visual processing machinery, but most of visual processing happens unconsciously. We don't know what we're doing. And so, a great example is a hitter in Major League Baseball. Typical Major League fastball arrives at home plate in 4/10 of a second, but it takes 6/10 of a second to have a conscious thought. So, how do they do it? For years, people thought it's reaction time. We need to train people to have quick bats. Interestingly, even great hitters think that the reason they're great hitters is because they have such great reaction time. But one of my favorite books, Sports Gene, by David Epstein, he tells the story of Albert Pujols, who gets tested, and it turns out that his reaction time is thoroughly average, for the, not just for baseball players, for the adult male population. And what it turns out that baseball players are doing when they hit well is they're reading cues from the pitcher before he delivers the ball. What is the angle of his arm? What is the speed of rotation of his hips? And they don't even know that they're doing this. And so the decision, there's a linkage between the perception and the action and the decision that's not always that athletes aren't always aware of. And so one of the things I posit is, when we want to ask a player, what should you do? Sometimes a better question is, what should you look at? Or what are you looking at? Or what do you see right now? Because that's really where the decision starts, with what you perceive. And when players make the wrong decision, it's often because they are not looking in the right place or looking at the right things.
One of the things I love what you said, just a very short sentence in that chapter: expertise is knowing what to look for and
Yeah.
then knowing how to find it. And so what you're suggesting to a coach is a part of the coaching process related to decision making is directing players' attention out into relevant parts of the environment, and helping players discover what is relevant, why is it relevant, and how they're going to use that information. That seems to be a big part of what you're trying to say to coaches.
Definitely. To find, the expertise is finding the signal amidst the noise,
Yeah.
Perceptively and otherwise. And I do think that that's the struggle of the athlete, and often a hidden struggle. And so just bringing that struggle to light so that coaches can manage it and be attentive to it and see it happening. Um, I think that's really where the cognitive science took me, which is to focus on the act of perception, which I think that we assume that the act of perception is automatic, and the science tells us that it's anything but.
You've alluded to this already, but a big part of this chapter is differentiating between decision making, which is
Yeah.
the fast thinking, and problem solving, which is the slow thinking. But as you're kind of saying, there's a link there as well. If problem solving requires a deep knowledge of the sport that you're playing in, you're competing in, and then decision making can become even faster when you have that deep knowledge. So great decision seems to me to be a combination of, I know about the patterns in my sport, I've seen
Yeah.
these patterns, I have a good knowledge of the temporal factors of what's going on around me, or the factors of what's going on around me, combined with looking and then obviously anticipating based on what you've seen.
Yeah, I think that's probably better put than I put it in the book. but yeah, I think that problem solving is a slow process that you would engage in training when you you come to understand the patterns of the world and successful patterns, and then you want to develop deep familiarity with them so that you can see them, perceive them, and make decisions about them quickly in a game. Because in most cases, I mean, it's interesting. We talk about football coaches all the time talk about football as a problem-solving game, but there really isn't time for problem solving in most situations during the game. And so, really, what we're talking about is it's a lot of pattern recognition and familiarity with a wide range of visual scenarios that allow you to make a connection between the perception and a high quality action. And then I think the most interesting thing, is one of the ways that sport is different from school is we're trying to coordinate the problem solving of 11 different players or 15 different players or 5 different players at the same time. And so, to me, the killer application is we are all looking for and understand similar perceptive cues so that we see them and we see each other see them before the opposition. And so we can react a little bit faster. And that to me is where a great coach differentiates themselves. That's where, if you ask me what's behind Pep Guardiola's, genius, so there are probably a lot of things, but I think one of them is that his players know what to look for and know what one another are looking for, and so they see the signal that one another are giving, and they're reading the signals in a similar way across the team. And so what looks like improvisation is actually shared reaction to and reading of perceptive signals.
I mean, bringing the ideas in this chapter together. I mean, I think it's really fascinating, Doug, because last week we had Lisa Feldman Barrett on the show, the neuroscientist, and the work she's done and the new book she's got out. What we spoke about really relates lovely to some of the stuff she's spoken about in this chapter. I mean, she talks about expertise being chunks of memory, being prediction. That the brain is a prediction machine, essentially. And so, kind of to sum up what I drew from this chapter and what I'm drawing on now is that the capacity to make fast and accurate decisions is almost based twofold on coaches helping players build applicable memory, domain-specific memory, helping them understand the game as much as possible, combined with the capacity to scan. Scanning being looking. And I think you did mention the work of Geir Jordet, the Norwegian sports psychologist in this chapter. And then, as you mentioned there, great coaches can help players see ahead based on that applicable memory, based on scanning. So again, prediction. And you had a wonderful example here, but from the world of music, a study.
That's right. Yeah.
Daniel Beliavsky, piano player, is that right? And as an expert piano player, some research demonstrated that he scans ahead as he's reading the music, and that enables him, I suppose, to interpret the music more effectively.
Yeah, this video is so fascinating. It compares his eye movement to the eye movement of one of his students, she's an excellent musician also.
Yeah.
And the difference is they compare the range of eye movement, and his eyes are steadier, which is, to me, exactly the opposite of what you would expect. You would think that an expert would take in more information, would scan for a wider variety of data points during the endeavor, but it's the opposite. And there's a name for this function. It's called the quiet eye, and it's been demonstrated in sporting endeavors too that experts look at less. This is where that phrase that you noted, expertise is knowing what to look at. Experts look at less because they know where the signal is likely to come, and what's noise, and what selective attention is as much knowing what to ignore as what to pay attention to. And so that's really what differentiates him is he's steady and quiet and calm. His eyes know where to go. They know what to look for, and his eyes are quieter than hers are, and that's the mark of his expertise.
What I love about this chapter as well, Doug, is that I mean, it is a long chapter, and it's full of
Yeah, sorry about that.
it's brilliant, and I don't say that in a negative way at all. If on the contrary, I'm saying that very positively, because you present some of the scientific research, and you do that in a manner that really helps people be engaged with the text. But then you move on and you teach us as coaches how to be a great teacher of decision making, and divide training activities. And again, we're talking about soccer here, but it would be the same for all team invasion sports. You divide training activities into three types: skill acquisition, games based, and tactical activities. And you feel a lot of the decision making can happen can be built through these three types of activities.
Yeah. I think they all have a role in decision making. So,
Mm.
skill acquisition activities are really about automizing a skill for the most part, and that's critically important because to be able to make good decisions, strong decisions, you have to free working memory so it can focus on perception. One of the things that happens when working memory is full is it degrades the quality of perception. So that's a key role. Um, and then the second group of activities are game-based activities, and these are often sort of small-sided games that are a distortion of the game. They're designed to give a lot of iterations of experiences, making small reads and perceptions about things like body language and spacing and positioning. The sort of the building blocks of the game.
Mm.
I quote in here this great passage from this sort of eminent reading researcher in the U.S., Mark Seidenberger, who he describes reading as a quasi-regular system. It has statistical tendencies, he says, but not inviolable rules. And so, learning to read is to gather information about those statistical tendencies, but not inviolable rules at the speed of sight. As fast as you see them, you can read them. And so game-based activities to me are like, the classic example of this to me is the rondo. It's about reading space and body movement and shape and which way is the ball going to go over and over and over and over and over and over and over. So you get very, very good at that. And then there are sort of tactical games, which are about installing a game model and the way that we want to play and doing a lot of the coordinating of like, here's how we seek to play. Here's what we like. Here's what we want to do in this situation when there's pressure on the ball. Here's how we want to react when they press us. Here's how we want to react to coordinate decision making across players. And so lots of times I just find like I sometimes go to coaching workshops and people have very emphatic views about what the best way to teach is. And with all humility, one of the things I would want to say is there is no best way to teach, or the best way to teach depends on what you're trying to teach. Because you would teach all these three things differently: skill acquisition, game-based activity versus tactical activity. And so the answer is, this coach who I really admire in the US says to me, the answer is it depends. It doesn't mean that all answers are equal because there's still science behind it, but your decision about the teaching approach is contingent upon what you're trying to teach players to do and what kind of setting you're teaching them in.
I don't know how much time you spend on Twitter these days, Doug, but the term "it depends" it sounds like such an innocuous term, but it's become one of the most explosive terms in Twitter sphere related to coaching. And look,
Oh, is that right?
yeah, so but I absolutely
I'm
agree.
happy to say I missed that whole debate.
Keep missing it. Keep registering yourself absent from that debate. I can assure you that's one I'm gently withdrawing myself from. And but I completely agree. I mean, personally, I'm a bit of a pragmatist, and I think that's what you've got to be as a coach, and certainly as a sports psychologist as well. Listen, I mean, it was such a fantastic chapter, and we could talk for hours on that chapter, but let's move on to chapter 2, which is about planning and design. And again, I suppose at the very beginning of this podcast, I should have said that this book for me is psychosocial. this is about psychosocial.
Mm.
I think, my work, Doug, I talk a lot about putting coaches need to put psychosocial first. And often when I say that, I get coaches coming back to me and going, yes, I think mental health is really important, and welfare and well-being,
Yeah.
and some
Yeah.
confidence stuff. And it's like, no, well, yes, it is, but you've missed the broader point here, which is psychosocial is always happening. And I'm always saying to coaches, in my humble opinion, when they sit down with that bit of paper in front of them, with their session ahead of them, their planning and design needs to incorporate a lot of psychosocial stuff, or at
Yeah.
least that needs to be considered. And to me, this whole chapter is, look, it's about that. Tell us a little bit about your take on planning and design.
This is fascinating. I so appreciate your comment about, I just wrote down what you said about psychosocial is always happening, because this is a really technical chapter, but at the core of it is a psychosocial, well, probably many psychosocial dynamics, but one psychosocial dynamic in particular that I think is endemic in the world of sports. And I would describe it as, it's halftime and we're playing, Crosstown United, and we knew that we needed to press against Crosstown United, and we worked on pressing in practice, and our pressing is crap. And the coach is furious. And he, at the halftime, he says, "What, we worked on pressing all week. What happened?" And, we talked about pressing. We're not pressing. And he's mad at the players because he believes that their failure to press is a failure of their humanity. It's a failure of their desire, their failure, their willingness, their bravery, their courage, their attentiveness, you know, their willingness to do what he's asked, their respect for him. And very quickly, breakdowns in learning get personalized, and there becomes a relational component to them. And I'm not saying that there aren't times when athletes fail because they're inattentive and they don't want to do what the coach asks them to do, or they're not concentrating. Those things are real. But in many cases, I discuss this more in chapter 4, that they're breakdowns of learning that we often, the first reaction to learning is recriminating the learner. But the most common place where that happens is we underestimate the role of forgetting. We see players do something in practice, and we presume that because they can do it at the end of a training session on Tuesday, that it is going to show up on Saturday. And the thing that we overlook most in any learning environment, classroom or training ground, is the role of forgetting. It's possibly the most powerful force in learning. It is a ruthless and tireless opponent. And so, one of the graphics in the book, beautifully done by Oliver Caviglioli, by the way, is he draws a forgetting curve of, this is stuff that we've known since the 1800s, which is, as soon as you stop learning something, you start forgetting it. And within hours, people will have forgotten more than half of what they've learned. And so if you evaluate player understanding at the end of a training session, you will assume that they're ready to play on Saturday. But the minute they leave the training session, they start forgetting, and they've forgotten half of it by Wednesday, and they've forgotten more of it by Thursday. And so coaches have to be attentive to installing things in long-term memory if they want players to remember them. And they have to have practiced retrieving ideas from long-term memory if they want to do it fast, if they want to be able enough to do it under performance conditions in a game. And so what this tells us, among other things, is that even a perfect training session is it would be almost impossible even for a perfect training session to install any idea in long-term memory, because it requires repetition spaced over time with gaps in between. So if I really want players to learn something for the long run, I have to plan with learning in mind. I have to think about, I'm going to bring it up on Tuesday, and then I'm going to bring it up again on Thursday, and then I'm going to bring it up again next Thursday, and then the Tuesday after that, and then the Thursday after that. And that only the sort of this cognitive psychologist says the best time to remember something is when you've begun to forget it, because then you struggle to remember it, and the struggling to remember it encodes it more deeply in long-term memory. And so this process of retrieval and coming back to and re-executing and remembering what I've learned previously is the key to building long-term memory. And if it's not in long-term memory, it's not coming out in the game.
Before we get on to ideas to promote retrieval, essentially this comes under the heading of there's a difference between performance and learning. And as you
Yes.
say in this chapter, performance in training is a false signal. I love this. Performance in training is a false signal.
And thunder should clap in the background as you read that.
Yeah, performance in training is a false signal. And so, I mean, in very simple terms, stuff, we just got to remember that, haven't we, as coaching? What we see isn't actually what's going on. We're not necessarily seeing learning in that moment. We're just seeing performance. And we've got to be patient as coaches, haven't we?
Yeah. And that it's, have to realize that we're part of that we've taught someone how to do something, but that they have not learned it yet. That learning is learning. The chapter starts with this quotation from some eminent cognitive psychologist that learning is a change in long-term memory, and that if I don't get into long-term memory, players won't have learned it. It won't come out in the game. I will end up on this treadmill of constantly, reteaching things because they disappear. And again, to go back to your point about the psychosocial is always with us. In the end, if I don't understand the issues of cognition and cognitive psychology that are playing out, my first instinct will be to blame players and to corrode my relationship with them, because I will blame them for this process that is really a cognitive process of, people will forget. People will. You have. I think I start the chapter with the phrase, "You have forgotten almost everything you learned in your life, and if you don't believe me, have children wait 15 years and try and help them with their science or history homework."
As you're speaking there, I'm thinking about that tension around attribution.
Yes.
I'm thinking of something I try to get across in my work when I sit down with coaches and I'm talking with them, and sometimes their response is, well, Dan, it's not just us. The players have responsibility as well, and that's 100% correct. And you've mentioned this. You mentioned it about 5 minutes ago. Nobody's saying players don't have responsibility. Of course they do. But I almost wonder, when I reflect back, and I think I've said this on a previous episode of the Sports Site Show, if I think about the best environments I've been in, sporting organisations, sporting teams, it's almost when the coaching staff have an internal locus of control and the players have an internal locus of control. So both of them are looking to...
Everybody's first instinct is to blame themselves.
Yeah.
Or to hold themselves accountable. Blame is
yeah, absolutely.
Or to examine their possible role in the breakdown. It doesn't mean it's not. The other person doesn't also have a role. My first job is to ask myself questions about my own life.
Well, and then
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, and then it requires that psychological. We're going to mention this later in one of the chapters, but the psychological safety is then having a good, honest conversation about, from there, once everybody's sort of looked at themselves in the mirror and said, okay, this is what I'm doing, and this isn't what I'm doing. But I just want to finish off this chapter by because again, it's rich in detail. And you've mentioned this word retrieval, and ultimately it is a scientific term, but ultimately what we want skills to transfer into match day. We want players to be able to retrieve what they've learnt and perform on game day, on match day. And you've mentioned that learning happens over time. It's spaced. And there's lots of different things that coaches can do within their training sessions to help them. A lot of, I suppose, desirable difficulties they can incorporate into their training activities to help learning to happen. Do you just want to give us a flavour of what a couple of those one or two desirable difficulties could be?
Sure. I think one of the simplest ones is, I think my perception when I first started studying coaching was, I believed in the idea of blocked practice, which is that if you wanted to master something, you should put intense focus on it for a sustained period of time for 45 minutes unbroken. And I still think there are settings when that's powerful. When you're first introducing an idea, there is a benefit to a Zen-like focus on something. But one of the things that the science of retrieval practice talks about is what you would call interleave practice, which is if you practice retrieving one thing and then you go on to a different topic, everything about the first thing leaves your brain as you concentrate on the second topic. And then if you come back to the first thing, it's harder to remember it. And again, that struggle to remember is really important and really powerful in building long-term memory. And essentially what you're doing if you shift activities is you're creating you're creating a psychological state that is equivalent to the passage of time without the passage of time. In other words, it gives you a more efficient way to bring in retrieval practice. So what I think one of the things that this opens us up to is the idea of I work for something on 20 minutes. I work on building out of the back for 20 minutes, and then we go and we work on combination play for 15 minutes, and then we come back to building out of the back, and I say, great, let's build out of the back, go. And all of a sudden, it's harder to remember, and players have to struggle more to remember the principles that I'm talking about. And suddenly, two things will happen: their execution will be less proficient than it was before we took the break and went on to something else. But the degree to which their learning is encoded in long-term memory will increase. So it will look less efficient to me, but it will actually be arguably more efficient. At least this is what cognitive psychology tells us. And then I think there are all these sorts of questions about like how much and how often do I try and implement this idea in my training sessions? And the answer to a lot of those questions is I don't know. But I think it is a profound application of a proven principle from cognitive psychology. And so like one of the coaches that I talk to here talks about how a Major League Baseball team used to do all blocked practice, and they would have guys hit fastballs, then curveballs, and then sliders. And then they realized that it's actually better for players if it's first they go fastball, curveball, slider, so that after each pitch, I practice hitting a different pitch. I forget how to hit the other pitch, and then I have to come back to it, and I struggle. And then it's even better if I can randomize and have players not know what pitch is coming and have to, adapt in the moment. And that cognitive struggle makes them more game ready.
Well, I could talk again, like chapter one, talk about that chapter for hours, but I'm conscious of time. We'll move on to chapter three, which is giving feedback. And you've mentioned the term working memory before, and I think it's worth us pausing and defining working memory, which I'll get you to do. Put you on the spot there, Doug. But essentially, its feedback is about being aware on the loads on working memory, isn't it? And that seems like a major theme in this chapter. So it's about working memory and attention. Why don't you talk to us a bit about this chapter and define working memory for us?
Sure. So working memory is thinking that you're conscious of doing, and it's incredibly powerful. The thing probably arguably that differentiates us from every other species is our capacity, the richness and depth of our capacity in working memory to execute critical thinking, right? We conceptualized penicillin and relativity and the overlapping central back because shout out to Chris Wilder there. Because of the power of our working memory. But working memory also has limitations. It's extremely small. Phone numbers are 7 digits and usually no more in any country because working memory is so small, we can hold on to so little at any given time. And if we try to hold on to more information, several things happen. First of all, if I try to keep more ideas in working memory than my working memory is capable of keeping, given how limited it is, some of those things will start to leave, and I won't be able to concentrate on them all. And I will either not be able to execute what I'm doing, or I won't be able to think about all the things I'm trying to think about, or I won't encode the things that I'm thinking about in long-term memory, or my perception will degrade. So a good example of this is if you're driving in your car and you're having a conversation on your cell phone, even if you're hands-free, you're 10 times more likely to have an accident. And the reason for this is that if you're trying to make a left turn across traffic and you're talking to your wife about, what you need to pick up at the market on the way home, and you're trying to remember those things, your working memory is full. And suddenly your capacity to judge the rate of approach of an oncoming car goes down precipitously. And so one of the really interesting things about feedback is one of the most common things we do with athletes, right? We're constantly telling them how they're doing and giving them advice and guidance and hoping to help them reflect on their work by putting ideas into their working memory. But we often overload their working memory. We tell them 5 things at once.
So, because of the limitation of working memory, our feedback needs to be specific, it needs to be crisp, it needs to be efficient, the right words need to be chosen, which I think you describe as economy of language.
Absolutely. Maybe if there's a most useful phrase in this chapter, it's a quote from a coach in New Zealand who says, "If you chase 5 rabbits, you catch none." So lots of times we try to accelerate the learning process for an athlete by stopping them. We tell them one thing we think they should do, and then we add a second and a third and a fourth. And the result of that is that people can't concentrate on that many things at once. And so the most likely outcome, well, the best possible outcome is they'll choose one of the 5 things I've told them to think about, and they'll implement that. But I won't really know which one they focused on. I won't be able to watch to see whether they're doing it well. But more likely, trying to think of all those things at once will drive all of them productively out of their working memory. They won't remember any of them. They won't be able to apply any of them particularly well. And I'll probably I'll probably reduce their performance in the moment because they will be less perceptive because their working memory is full of 5 ideas that they are struggling to reconcile with what they're trying to do. And this comes up in a later chapter, but I think this is one of the things that see so often when athletes in a game situation, coaches telling players to do things while they're trying to execute often degrades their performance because I'm putting things into their working memory at exactly the time when they need their working memory to read the perceptive cues in the environment. You really can't teach anything new in a game. The best you can hope for is to remind players of things that you've encoded deeply in practice.
Because one coaching point, gets players to mastery faster than 5.
Exactly, which is counterintuitive. But if you give them 5 coaching points, the most likely outcome is you will give them the same 5 coaching points a few minutes later, and the same 5 coaching points a few minutes after that. And can I say that I think one of the other things that happens is one of the biggest risks with feedback generally is that players learn to ignore our feedback. And in part, that's because we show that, not intentionally, but we show that our feedback is not very important to us. And what I mean by that is you're running a training session and you stop the team to say, right, when we're building out of the back, we need to make sure that passes are struck at pace, because our goal here is to move the opposition from side to side rapidly and expose gaps in their shape. So the ball has to be struck very quickly from side to side, right? That's good feedback in the sense that it's one thing. So I'm going to be watching for that pace of pass, go. That's good feedback because I'm telling players to do one single thing and they can really concentrate on it, as opposed to here are 15 things about building out of the back. But then a coach might say, great footwork, Thomas. Love the entry pass. Better decision, Carlos. Talking about everything but the pace of pass, which says to players, I just stopped training to talk about pace of pass, but I've already forgotten it 10 seconds later. Why would they be thinking about it 10 seconds later if I'm not? And so not only are they not getting feedback on how they're doing and implementing the thing that I've talked about, which slows their progress, but I'm also intimating to them that, my feedback isn't very important to me because I've usually forgotten what I said 10 seconds after I've said it. And so, I don't think that every single comment after that stoppage has to be about the pace of pass, but it's really useful if 6 of the 8 of them are like, yes, that's the pace we're looking for, Thomas. Yes, strike it even harder, even more pace, Carlos. You can do it. Yes, that's what we're looking for. And now I'm not only helping them to understand whether they're effective at using the feedback, but I'm telling them after I give you feedback, I'm watching to see whether they use it. It's important to me. That's what this culture is about following through on the things that we say that we're going to do. And so I just think that's another example of what you're talking about, which is the technical and the psychosocial are both happening at the same time in so many different interactions. So I'm always communicating to players what feedback means and how important it is to me and what I want them to do with it, even while I'm giving them specific technical guidance on some aspect of the game.
What you're saying there makes me think about the relationship between playing and coaching, in as much as I talk to players about staying on task, the importance of staying on task, paying attention to the task at hand and listening to you speak there. it reinforces this notion of the coach needs to stay on task in order to help a player learn.
I think that's right. I think distracted coach, distracted player, focused coach, focused player. So if I think I tell the story in the book of this coach. I'm watching a training session, and he has this beautiful stoppage where he tells the girls that he's coaching. This girl tries to get open in space behind a player, and she fails to do it. And he says, you have to make 2 runs, one for the defender and one for the ball. And he shows her how to cut into the blind spot behind the defender to fool the defender that she's going one way, and then when she's in the blind spot, cut back the other way. First run is to fool the defender. Second run is to get the ball. It's beautiful feedback. It's expressed in concise, economical language that's memorable to players. And then he says, I want to see you guys doing that, go. And the girls start doing it. And it's breathtaking to see the difference in their play. And 30 seconds later, he spots something else he wants to work on, and he stops them and he says, great, one other thing I want to talk about is, and suddenly everything that they're working on disappears. Sustaining focus on an idea and saying, yes, we're getting better. Let's keep working on this. One thing I want you to notice about it is how you can use your body language or here's situations when I want you to try and use this, one run for the player, one run for the ball, one run for the defender, one run for the ball. And that he was so close to having this breakthrough for the players, but he kind of lost his own focus on this topic. And so did they. And, a minute after the original feedback, they were just sort of doing this thing beautifully, but 10 minutes later, it had evaporated.
We're talking about giving feedback in terms of concise, precise coaching points. I know a lot of coaches listening in will be reflecting on their coaching and thinking about utilizing questions and the importance of asking questions within their coaching practice. And you do spend quite a lot of time in the chapter, I think towards the end of the chapter, talking about intentional questioning. Just briefly there, what are some of the points you touch upon in the chapter?
Well, I think the one thing, the intentional is about what is the purpose of my question? What types of questions? So there's sort of categories of questions that I propose. One of them is perception questions, right, where I'm trying to guide players' eyes to what they see.
Yeah.
One of them would be, sort of retrieval practice questions, which is, reinforcing background knowledge. What is the principle of play we should be thinking about here? Some of them are sort of problem-solving type questions, I think coaches often love the idea of a discovery-based question of someone inferring what the solution is. But just as often, the challenge of the game is we actually know what the solution is, and the challenge is implementing in this situation under these contexts and these constraints. And so, how do we, rather than sort of what should we do here? Sometimes a better question is, we know what we want to do. How do we do it here? What are the challenges that we see? What are the solutions to application here? And so, I think just being intentional about I think it's important to ask a wide variety of types of questions so that I'm socializing a wide variety of types of thinking by players.
No, I love that. And I love that part in the chapter because I think that we as coaches can be guilty of defining. Well, I was going to say defining. I ask questions and sort of it's full stop, underline, that's it. And it's like, well, there's lots of different types of questions we can ask, and I like that you differentiate between those types of questions. So I think that's
just asking a question by virtue of it being a question does not ensure any particular thinking outcome.
Yeah,
I have to be more intentional in thinking what kind of question do I want? What is it I want players to? What type of thinking do I want players to do? And how will the question help me get there? The question is not necessarily beneficial. There are downsides to questions too. They're often slow, and if I haven't thought about what the answer is to the question, and it's not a good question, then nobody knows the answer, and they're sort of looking at me funny. And it takes 3 times, and we play what's in coach's pocket, where I try to get them to say what I'm thinking of, and everyone just wants to play. So, just asking questions is not inherently good. Asking good questions that are productive in the moment and help me focus on the learning task is beneficial.
Let's spend a bit of time on chapter 4, and then I'll get you to summarize chapters 5 and 6
Yeah.
to finish off. Chapter 4 is about checking for understanding, and I suppose the overarching theme here is neatly summarized by the immortal John Wooden, who said, "Well, I've taught it, but have they learned it?" There's a difference, isn't there, between teaching and learning, essentially.
Absolutely, and there's an inevitable gap there. And I think, in quoting Wooden in the book, I think I talk about, one of the interesting things about his quotation is his calm acceptance of the fact that gaps between teaching and learning will emerge. I will teach things and they will struggle to learn it. And if that doesn't happen, then I'm not teaching challenging enough things and not teaching realistic things. And so the question is, how do I make myself ready to spot the gaps, remediate the gaps as they happen, and make players comfortable participating in exposing the gaps rather than trying to hide their mistakes from me? What I want is a culture where players willingly expose their lack of understanding so I can find it more easily. If Wooden's quote is, teaching is the difference between I taught it and they learned it, the challenge is finding the spaces where they don't understand what I've taught. They're not always readily evident, but if players are if players are trying to hide them from me, hide their lack of knowledge from me as the coach, it just got 10 times harder to do that. Whereas if they willingly share or willingly discuss their lack of understanding, then our work just got a lot easier.
As you mentioned, it's difficult to spot the gap, and it's difficult to spot the gap because the way we pay attention, essentially, the difficulty of paying attention, we miss things because of the way our visual cortex is designed. We can suffer from attentional blindness, so we can miss things. And I love some of the things you suggest in this chapter, such as having checklists when you're out there with regard to things that you're striving to coach. You talk about anticipating errors, and you also talk about something called exemplar planning. So I've given you a little choice there. You can talk about whatever you want: anticipating errors, or exemplar planning, or give us some ideas here.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is about disciplining your eyes as a coach and recognizing that perceptive challenges are not just for players; they're for coaches as well, and that learning to see and seeing what's happening in front of you, we presume, is so simple and straightforward that it requires no reflection. But it is one of the primary tools of a coach is to see accurately, and watching carefully is one of the prime competencies. So many times in a practice, I'll see a coach give players feedback, and the players simply will not do what the coach just asked them to do, and the coach won't notice. And this is one of the most common phenomena in cognitive psychology, is our ability to not see what is right in front of our eyes. And so the first thing that I think you have to think about observation, one, is deeply important, and two, as a data-driven endeavor. This is another place where working memory is a challenge, and I build this chapter around this video of this math teacher, Denarius Fraser, who he's walking around the classroom. His students are completing 2 math problems, and one of the most simple things that he does is he's taking notes on what they do on a clipboard. And if you ask, the average teacher would not be taking notes; they would just be walking around and they would be taking, quote, mental notes. And I would just argue that if you know anything about the limits of working memory, and you're trying to watch 18 athletes, or you're trying to watch 30 students do 2 math problems with 4 steps each, and you think you're going to walk around for 5 minutes, and at the end of it know what happened and have what's in your memory not be accidental, but actually be strategic, and you'll know that 7 students were struggling to find the remainder, and that's the most important thing to talk about. You only do that if you're writing down observations as you go. There is no such thing as mental notes in an environment that complex. So he's tracking, but he's tracking the data and treating observational information like data. But then one of the other fascinating things that you notice is, as he's tracking the data, he's not like writing down whole sentences. He's just ticking things off. And what that tells us is that in advance, he's made a list of the things that he thinks could go wrong and the things that he wants to go right. And and this makes it more likely that he sees them. I talk about these cognitive scientists, Shabris and Simons, and who are leading researchers in the idea of inattentional blindness, which is our ability to not see what's right in front of our eyes. And they say the greatest way to combat against this is to know what you're looking for and to anticipate the things that could go right and could go wrong. And so by doing this exercise of I'm planning a training exercise and I think about, great, if players struggle, what will I see? What problems will emerge? I'm going to write them down. First of all, I make it more likely that I will see them if they happen, as opposed to just sort of looking right past them. And then second, if I've written them down, I can tick them off as they happen, and I can say, 8 players are struggling with this. This is the thing to stop and talk to the team and talk about. And so that's the idea of planning for error, which is anticipating mistakes that players are likely to make. I think the other thing that it does, just to your point about the psychosocial is always with us, is it makes me less resentful and less frustrated when mistakes emerge, because I have presumed from the beginning that players will struggle with things, and it's just a question of which things they'll struggle with. And so I don't come in and get mad and say, we've been working on this all week. I come in and say, right, I think the thing that we're failing to understand is this, and here's what we can do about it.
It helps promote what you describe as an emotional constancy.
A culture of error. And I think this is, if we want players to participate in exposing their misunderstandings to us, we have to make it feel safe to do so. And that doesn't mean we don't talk about mistakes. This is the thing, like when I talk about this in workshops with coaches, this is maybe the single most misunderstood thing, which is what I'm talking about when I talk about a culture of error is we are comfortable saying that's wrong. And that's so interesting. It's going to help. I'm so like this math, maybe the quote that encapsulates it is a math teacher who in teaching his students says, I'm so glad I saw you make that mistake. It's going to help me to help you. It's going to help us be better on Saturday. Many coaches interpret that as being sort of vague about whether something's wrong, right? Well, that's one way to do it, but another way you could do it is X. That's the way we usually tell people that did something wrong, but that's not actually telling them that it's wrong. What I want to do is find ways to tell someone that it's a mistake in a way that makes it safe to be wrong and makes it interesting. Like, I'm really glad. I love that you want to get direct to the goal as soon as you win the ball. But in this case, direct isn't on. We've got to find a better solution. So let's study what some better solutions might be. Or I love that you're attentive to keeping your shape here. Or, I like that you're thinking about keeping your shape here. But in this case, it's much more important to get out and close down the shot. So let's roll it back. Glad I saw that. Now we know. Let's all be really attentive to that. And that is saying the mistake is a good thing because it gave us an opportunity to learn, but it's not vague about the fact that it's a mistake. And when I do that, and when I do it with emotional constancy, and I don't blame players for making mistakes and make them feel comfortable and even fascinated with this is actually so interesting. We're going to study. So many people think we should play direct here, but it's different than you might think. And the reasons why are fascinating. Now all of a sudden I'm making error a worthwhile thing, and studying our mistakes and learning from them valued, and something that players are not averse to sharing.
Well, you're moving into the cultural territory there, and chapter 5 is about building culture, and then chapter 6 is talking about issues in growth and development. Just to finish us off for a couple of minutes, why don't you just take the audience through a few of the themes that you speak about in both chapter 5 and 6?
Sure. Well, chapter 5 is about culture, and culture is so profound. When we remember our sporting days, oftentimes what we remember is the culture of a team or an organization that we are a part of. I think I say you can get a lot wrong if you get the culture right, and people compete and love to compete and support each other and approach the game with the right mentality. And those things don't happen by accident. And so I just try and examine what are some of the tools for building culture and what do good cultures look like. And maybe one of the tools that I would highlight is the power of first of all, I'd say that culture is built through habits. You can have a 30-minute conversation where you talk to players about how they should respond to making mistakes, but much more profound in influencing what your culture is around mistake making is how you react in the 15 different moments when players make mistakes and you're not thinking about what you're communicating in that culture. You're communicating unintentionally whether you get frustrated with players at mistakes and how they should react to them. And so culture is built out of habits, daily habits, often when I'm attending to other things. And the single most important habit in terms of building culture is language and the words that I use for things. I do kind of a deep dive into a case study of Jesse Marsh, who probably isn't as well known in the UK, but he's one of the top handful of American football coaches. He coaches at Red Bull Salzburg in Austria. A lot of people think he'll eventually take over the national team. He's just a brilliant guy. Went to Princeton. He's really fascinating, and he's obsessed with language. And he told me the story of how when he took over New York Red Bulls here in the U.S., he set out to shape their culture through words. And so he would tell his players stories. One of the stories was a story about Roger Bannister and how he toiled and toiled to break the 4-minute mile, and people speculated for years that it would be impossible, physiologically impossible to break the 4-minute mile. And then finally, when Bannister broke it, suddenly, within a number of years, 6, 7, 8 guys also broke the 4-minute mile. But because he had knocked down the sort of perception of this barrier, suddenly what became physiologically possible for lots of people, was changed. So he told him that story, and he said, so when we talk about Roger Bannister, it should always remind us that we're always fighting against our perceptions of what's possible, and that if we can overcome our perceptions, then our actions will follow. And so they would use that phrase constantly. He would remind them, of the story by using the phrase Roger Bannister, and he would sprinkle it into practices, and so that he was basically doing what all cultures do, which is building a language that describes our specific values. And he had technical terms that he wanted players to be. His system is built on really aggressive pressing, what I would call like exuberant pressing. Like I watched him train one time, and he said, and the reward for scoring a goal was, instead of you getting the ball back, the other team got the ball back because you wanted to be in a position where they had the ball and you could press them. That he was trying to socialize them to think that way. So he has all these terms that he's developed for like different aspects of pressing. And by giving a word to it, he allowed players to identify it. And so one of them was like a specific way in which you get into the space to block. So he has a name for this thing. He names it into being, and then he can reinforce it. And during games and even during practices, he awards points on a chart for players who do it. And so he builds their conception of this idea. Language doesn't just reflect our thoughts, but it shapes our thoughts and creates them. And so he's creating the world that his players see by naming these concepts of pressing into being and then reinforcing them. And he does this with both technical aspects and psychosocial aspects of the team, and really builds just a vibrant culture, starting with language. So that's chapter 5. Chapter 6 is kind of a mishmash, isn't quite a so this is the answer to a lot of questions about long-term development, particularly long-term development for players, and how do I think about the goal not just of winning this weekend, but of developing players over the long run so that they become the best that they can be. And then and I think it's often obvious to coaches that players succeed at that endeavor when they have a growth mindset, and they don't shrink from challenge and love to try and get better every day. And then I try and turn that lens on coaches and say, yeah, look, let's also talk about long-term development for you as a coach, and what are the keys to getting better every day and your own long-term development. Because if you're going to do this for your life, you deserve to love it and get better at it, and see yourself improving.
Fascinating stuff, mate. And I love that. I really enjoyed reading chapter 6, and I loved the Jesse Marsh stuff in chapter 5. And it resonates so much with my work on helping players play with attention, intensity, and positive intent, through words and story and metaphor and analogy. I think again, if I may say, I think as coaches, I don't know if we're socialized into this, but perhaps we are into this notion of, well, I just tell somebody what to do. I tell them to press, and I tell them to press, hard and fast. But actually, there might be a dozen other ways to help players engage with this notion of pressing, that gives them a better chance to press in the way that you want them to press. Actually, human beings need lots of stories and metaphors and words related to what you want them to do in order to motivate them to do it, because the human system is complex and motivation is complex, and motivation isn't just somebody wants it, somebody doesn't want it. It's mediated by confidence. It's mediated by mood, by affect, feeling, emotion. And so what Jesse Marsh is doing there is, for me, fantastic, because he's seeing his players as complex, adaptive systems, and he's understanding that actually he's got to hit them internally to actually extract the external from them.
And strike this, it's like a dance between, I quote Bielsa in the book saying, a coach has no choice other than to advocate for what he believes in and to build the culture about the things that he believes in. You can't build a system around something you don't believe in. But at the same time, the culture also has to be a shared culture, and it has to reflect and be in part a creation of the players. They have to feel like it's theirs as opposed to yours. And I think this is maybe the most fascinating dance of culture, which is like, how do I have a vision for what I want my team to be and help something players participate in building it and feel like it's theirs as well. I think one of the stories that Marsh tells is like he wanted to use this phrase, empty the tank, for just the level of effort that he wanted from his players. And so he said, I want to use this phrase. I want you to define the phrase so that we can use it together. And so this is like this sort of like yin and yang participation of like, I have a vision for the effort that is implicit in our pressing game. But I want you to put it into words and you to hold each other accountable. And when you define it, I want you to talk to each other about it so that it's, in the end, I think if you asked his players, they would believe that they had come up with it as much as he had. And so I think a lot of culture building is this process of stewarding or shepherding people through this unique application of a coach's vision that is envisioned uniquely by a specific team at a specific time, a specific place. One of the sidebar interviews is this great coach, Leslie Gallimore, who's one of the top women's coaches and women's soccer coaches in the country. And people would say, "What's your culture going to be like this year, coach?" And she would say, "I don't know yet. I haven't met my team. I haven't met my team. I have a vision, but each year it's going to be a little bit different because when they arrive, they're going to participate in shaping it."
Yeah, I love that, and I think that allows for diversity as well, because I think I've spoken before about this on the Sports Site show, but I think modern day cultures in team sports tend to focus on what's shared, but it's also what's different as well, and understanding what's different and helping to negotiating with players who see things differently and onboarding them, in order for them to feel a part of the team. I think going back to Jesse Marsh, I just listening to you speak about Jesse and the stuff he's doing there, it almost feels like he's thinking like a psychologist. There's that integration between, he's providing, let's say, a tool, a technique, empty the tank. But what he understands is he has to negotiate with the person in front of them as to what empty the tank looks like to them, how they perceive that. And it's, for instance, I have a technique called game face, and it's similar in as much as here's this technique of game face, which is a couple of words or a metaphor or something like that. And if I was to take an example, a player
Mm.
I'm working with has a game face of relentless and dominant. So it's just a couple of adjectives that they can use to describe who they want to be, how they want to be, how they want to go about their business on the pitch, how they want to execute every responsibility in their role. So relentless and dominant. But I want them then for 5 to 10 minutes to describe to me exactly what relentless and dominant looks like to them, what experiences or what they're experiencing, how they're executing, what actions they're executing relentless and dominant, what that looks like to them, what others are seeing, and so it's bringing the perception of the player into it. It's both mine and his or hers. It's Jesse's and it's his players.
I think that's right, and I think that's the dance, right? It's like it's theme and
Yes.
variation. It's like any answer is not okay. There's a range of possible answers that I want to shape, but I have to, but the player also has to shape it. When within that range, they have to, has to be an individual adaptation of a set of shared beliefs. So when I want I want players to share my beliefs and then express them in a unique adaptation of them. I think this is fascinating because maybe the piece of research that I was most surprised to put in the book, but that I kept coming back to, is the history of evolution and sort of some of the top evolutionary biologists that I read observation that we always think about about evolution as an individual function. We evolved to stand up and evolved to have oppositional thumbs and a big brain. But just as important to our survival is our cooperation. We only survived, we're a fairly weak species. We only survived because of our ability to cooperate and coordinate as groups. And so every sort of, we have evolved for this complex dance between the individual wanting to be dominant and strong and respected within the organization, and also our profound ability to sacrifice.
Mm.
Edward Wilson, the biologist, calls us eusocial, which is his term for like we're the only eusocial mammal for the depth of our willingness um, to sacrifice, to give up things for the larger endeavor. And so this dance of like the group, the group goal and the individual goal, it's constantly like altruism and selfishness, you know, back and forth in dynamic tension, different for everybody at the same time. I just like when I started to read about this description of of like how societies evolved and how humankind evolved, you can just see it playing out in the sporting endeavor of people's willingness to sacrifice for the group. Like that's the profound experience of team sports, but also their desire to be to have a role within the group and to know that their role is important, and everyone it's this constant dance of a mix of emotions. It's fascinating and complex, and I think that that's written in a lot of the in a lot of the stories that you're describing being drawn to in the culture side.
Well, we've evolved to strive to get along and get ahead, haven't we? And we're social creatures, and I think I'm a keen reader on personality science, for instance, and what a lot of people don't realise is personality science is based on us being eusocial
Yeah.
creatures. If you look at the structure of personality, which is strongly now hypothesized to be these 5 personality dimensions, those personality dimensions exist in order to help us to get along and to get ahead and to discriminate between behaviors within our group. That's why the major hypothesis is that's why we have different personalities, essentially different
Mm.
behaviors, but which are typical across human beings.
That it wouldn't work if we all had the same personality. So
It wouldn't work.
it's
We just,
fascinating.
yeah, it wouldn't have survived like that. Anyway, before we go down that rabbit hole, I'll draw things to a close because you've been very generous with your time. Doug, this is just such a great book. I know that I'm going to be constantly going back to it again and again. I know that it's something I'm going to be recommending the coaches I work with read, and so I'm looking forward to some commission money from you, mate. Just joking, just joking. Um, I thoroughly recommend it to everybody out there. To have a read. How can people get hold of it, mate? And if anybody's got any questions, I know you're a man on social media, so how can they get hold of you?
Sure. I'm Doug underscore Lemov on Twitter, and so you can find me there. Avoiding some of the, at least a couple of the Twitter controversies. I'm happy to find out. And the book is called The Coach's Guide to Teaching. You can get it through Amazon or preferably your local bookseller, because I love bookstores. And it's published by John Catt, and so it should be pretty easy to find. And can I say, Oliver Caviglioli, who's a great author in his own right, has done the illustrations for it, and they're one of the hidden gems. They're just a gem. I asked him to try and conceptualize the idea of checking for understanding and the idea of giving too much feedback, and each chapter starts with one of his really beautiful illustrations. So that's a bonus for those of you who pick up the book.
Well, it's a fantastic talent he's got, because they're quite esoteric things, aren't they? So it's not easy to conceptualize those things. So yeah, no, it's he's done it amazingly well. Listen, Doug, thank you so much for your time, mate, and really appreciate you coming back on. I'm looking forward to getting you on again when you've written your next one to do with sport.
You won't have to ask me twice. It's been fun.
Thank you so much. Well, everyone, that was Doug Lemov, and I really enjoyed that podcast. And I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Site Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.